Hi, welcome to Fast Thinking. I'm James Batchik, Program Assistant here at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. After 2 intense weeks that saw everything from on-field tragedy to incredible goals and shocking defeats, the Euro 2020 final match is set. It's Italy versus England. Soccer has always been a huge part of European culture and has massive economic and geopolitical implications. So on today's episode of Fast Thinking, with the final game set to be played this Sunday, we're asking, what is sports diplomacy? And what does this Euros tournament mean for soft power in Europe? Joining me today is Livia Godaert, an assistant director also with the Europe Center. Livia, welcome. My first question, just right off the bat for you, is what is soft power?
Yeah, thanks, James. It's great to be here. Soft power is a means of getting what you want, you being either a country or a multilateral organization, through influence and persuasion rather than through coercion via military or economic means. Essentially, how do we shape attitudes and preferences about a country or an IGO over the long term? What systems and policies can we use to persuade people?
What's sports diplomacy? How does that factor in?
So I would put sports diplomacy as one element of soft power. There's this idea of public diplomacy, really selling a country or an organization to the wider public, to the rest of the world. And sports is one really great way to do that. It's universal. It transcends borders, it transcends languages and lived experiences. And it really provides a branding opportunity for countries to establish themselves as a prominent player on the world stage. A really great example of this is the UEFA EURO 2020 tournament, which is why we're here today. James, can you talk a little bit about the Euros and why we're talking about them? Why does this fit into this conversation of sports diplomacy and soft power?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're totally right about the public diplomacy and sports diplomacy and this element in soft power. And this year's Euros are, I think, a great example of that. I think it's also not a mistake that these sports competitions, including the Euros, have been going on for decades now. So the Euros first started in the 1960s during the height of the Cold War, playing the Soviet Union, East versus West, when we had that Iron Curtain going right down through the middle of Europe. And it's kind of emerged since then. I think it's one of those elements of those types of sporting events that can kind of confer legitimacy, like you said, or impact some public perceptions. So really quick, some great examples would be, Russia's Winter Olympics in 2014 in Sochi, or China's 2008 Summer Olympics, and especially during the Cold War, like we said, when the Euros were actually, going on every 4 years. But during the Cold War, there were issues of boycotts during the Olympics. On the U.S. side, there was the Miracle on Ice. The Soviet Union had its defeat of the U.S. men's basketball team in the 1970s for its version of conferring legitimacy or making itself great. And of course, during these sporting events, when East Germany was around, its athletes were literally called diplomats in tracksuits, which I think really kind of just speaks to your points of this is how countries in many ways can just kind of use sports to kind of further their political aim or help out their image at a really core level. And then the Euro specifically. So in 2016, when the last Euros were hosted, the French were hosting it, and they actually have a whole public diplomacy and sports diplomacy website where basically they flat out said, we're using these events to boost French growth and attractiveness. And they pointed to the Euros of all the travel throughout France, all the tourists they brought in, as well as all the money they generated for it, as kind of a way to do that. So that's how the Euros kind of fit in with this public diplomacy. Now, question for you, Livia: how do the Euros matter in kind of a larger instrument of what it means to be a European?
Yeah, it's a really fascinating phenomenon. This is not the only pan-European competition. I would be remiss if I didn't bring up the Eurovision Song Contest as another example. But it's really part of a larger instrument that facilitates Europe's image as a model for the world. It's really important to countries that are not part of the EU, but are still either considered part of Europe or are trying to be considered part of Europe, part of that Euro-Atlantic space. Including Ukraine and North Macedonia, who were both in the group stage of this tournament. And in fact, Ukraine was in the knockout stage as well, and it was a really big deal for a country that's really trying to be seen as a force for good in Europe. There's also been games in Azerbaijan. That was one of the hosts this year, and so it really establishes a broader definition of Europe, beyond just the political 27 EU member states or 30 NATO member states. It really creates this pan-European idea. And the Euros are a great example of not just European identity, but European soft power in practice. James, I know we had some thoughts about that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it is, and I think it generates that a lot. And I think you can kind of point to a couple examples that really show you that soft power in practice. So I mean, I think we all saw it where Ronaldo was giving a press conference after a game, and he's sitting in front with in the press box. He's sitting with 2 Coke cans in front of him, and he picks them up and says, "Oh no, don't drink Coke, drink water." And he's got 550 some million followers on Twitter and Instagram and everything like that. He's this huge force, and the Coke price took a hit immediately afterwards. I'm not saying those are tied, but I don't think you can necessarily ignore that this power of advertising doesn't necessarily, or rather it goes both ways, and I think that's a great kind of aspect of showing that personal level of how Europeans, whether it's one person or one country, can kind of impact how we see the world. Of Ronaldo saying advocating for public health, or maybe he just doesn't like Coke. But regardless, it has an impact.
Yeah, I would agree. And, I think it's really interesting to watch too, how European soft power or European identity isn't a monolith. And in fact, it's an ongoing conversation that we actually are seeing at the Euros. There's a number of geopolitical and non-sports issues that are kind of woven in throughout the competition.
The Euros this year were called, one of the most political Euros kind of ever to take place, which I think is quite an impressive feat, given how long the Euros have been going on.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And it's also kind of wild to see, even in the midst of COVID, and I know that's been a huge driver of a lot of the controversy and political debate. There's also been some countries that are redefining their own position within Europe at the time. For example, the UK, who is playing against Italy in the final. This is their first Euro tournament. In fact, I think their first international sports tournament after they left the European Union.
It's also their first finals on a major stage since winning the World Cup in 1966. So it's been a long time coming for their supporters. For those who have their fingers crossed, and maybe those who have their fingers crossed for an Italy victory, there's still the big topic of obviously the UK and Europe, right? What does the UK stand to gain from this? What's going on with the Brexit situation?
It's an interesting time for the UK to be participating in a European tournament. There has been a lot of positive momentum around global Britain and how they are managing their exit from the European Union. There's been big movements on the international stage for them, hosting the G7, being the hosts of the semifinal and the final at the Wembley Stadium. And then they've got COP26 in the fall. So they're really establishing themselves as still a European country, even if not an EU country.
Yeah, I think it would be somewhat ironic for the EU in its first major tournament after Brexit to be winning the Euros. I think that would be somewhat of a bittersweet moment for a lot of people. To kind of sum it all up, the Euros are really emblematic of the struggles that Europe has been having between countries to kind of define what Europe is, what its values are, and how it's going to be projecting itself moving forward. But I have one final question for you, Livia. Is it coming home?
I hate to jinx it. I don't want to say anything and ruin the chance. But I'm hearing good things. I'm hearing some lions roaring.
Great. We'll have to see. Thank you everyone for joining, and enjoy the finals this Sunday.